Welcome to the Healthcare Technology Report, a leading information source on healthcare technology companies and solutions. In this episode, we speak with David MacMurchy, CEO of Lightship, a clinical trial services provider focused on increasing access and representation in research. Founded in 2018, Lightship partners with biopharma, CROs, and academic institutions to deliver traditional, hybrid, and decentralized trials through a combination of site services, mobile research units, and in-home nursing. David brings more than 25 years of experience in life sciences, with previous roles at PRA Health Sciences, EY, Pfizer, and IQVIA. At Lightship, he is dedicated to expanding access to clinical trials and advancing therapies that better reflect real-world populations. I am your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow. David, great to chat with you. Thanks for taking the time.
Pleasure. Great to chat with you.
So first off, those are great looking mobile trucks, the Lightship trucks. And as I was doing research, I was like, oh, that's a neat vehicle and kind of captures a part of what you provide in clinical trials. So maybe let's start there. What are those trucks for?
Awesome. Well, it's a great place to dive in. You know, we think about clinical trials, we act as a site, and those trials are mobile research units where they're listed on a 1572 if you want to get technical about it, but they're sites, they're extensions of sites, and we take them anywhere to go meet patients. And that's what we're about. We're about getting access to all patients for clinical trials.
And where can we see these trucks? Where are they today?
They're all over the US. So we have 12 right now. They're in California, Texas, Florida, tri-state, and I think that is it. But what we do is we park them up in locations. So we go into communities, generally underserved communities, don't have a hospital nearby. We put them in car parks. We put them in pharmacy car parks. We put them, you know, if we're doing for example, a Lyme disease study, we go and park them in a remote car park where people park their cars before they go for a walk and get eaten by ticks. So wherever we need to go to find patients and serve patients to be on clinical trials.
Now, it seems like you founded this company simultaneously with raising capital. Is that how it happened?
It is exactly how it happened. Yep.
And maybe give us a little bit of how that came about, because your background, it seems, was in corporate as well as in consulting.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting journey. I should say we founded the company with 3 great other partners, and we all brought different skill sets. So Tom Pike came from the big CRO industry, as did I. Alon is a serial entrepreneur and founder, and Alon really brought the expertise of how to engage venture firms. And it's been a really interesting journey, right? I think going from big corporate to sitting in a room with 2 people thinking, what do we do? How do we build this business? Has been an incredible journey. And I think I would say 2 things about raising and building. First of all, go with your gut. Like, you don't need to be an expert if you've got something that is going to make a difference. You know, venture funds are really interested in that. And secondly, it's not just about the money. It's all about the partnership, because there's a lot of ups, a lot of downs, and a lot of stuff in between. And money, sometimes hard to come by, sometimes easy to come by depending on the market. But great partners, and I've been very fortunate in that, great partners who are there for the journey is probably the one bit of advice I'd give anyone. And I would have given myself 5-6 years ago when we started this, for sure.
So how's it going today? Can you give us a sense for the scale of the business? And you can choose to use whatever metrics you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, we think of the metrics as the number of patients' lives that we touch. So when we started, we had nothing. Today, we've touched over 20,000 patients' lives in terms of visits, enrollment, and getting them onto studies. So it's 20,000 patients. I would say 95% of those patients would not have been on a clinical trial because they lived in the wrong location previously. So if you put it in those numbers, you've maybe got 18,000 people who are on clinical trials today through Lightship that would never have been on a clinical trial before. That's the main metric we use. Now, if you're an investor, you can then defer how much do you get per patient on a study, how many visits do you do, all that sort of stuff, and you can get to the revenue numbers, and we're private, so we don't share that. But our key metric is really all about patients. How many patients' lives are we impacting? And today, it's over 20,000, and about 18,000, 19,000 of those would not have had access if it wasn't for Lightship.
And are you on pace with how you kind of planned out scaling the business?
Well, let's think back 6 years ago when we started, it was just before COVID. And so if you draw a straight line from there to where we are today, we're probably slightly ahead.
Mm-hmm.
If you take the craziness of the COVID times, you reproject and you refocus, and there's lots of ups and downs in between. So I would say, are we happy with where we are? Yeah. And I think the main reason for that is we all set out to grow 2 times minimum a year and no more than 4 or 5 times at the top end. And the reason for that is we're delivering clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're delivering visits. We're drawing bloods, we're capturing vitals, we're capturing data. And I think my concern always was rapid growth puts a risk on quality. And quality is central to what we do. And if you think of big client of ours, top 5 pharmaceutical company, also an investor in the business, they're running, I don't know, maybe 100 trials. If we mess up on one of them, we'll never work with them again. And so that measured growth, focus on quality, number one issue is how do we ensure patient safety? It means that we always had relatively sensible growth plans. And I come back to what's great about our investors, right? Our investors bought that message, believe in that message, and have supported in that message when probably we could have grown quicker. And they've encouraged us to stick to our core values of ensuring patient safety and getting access for patients.
And this seems like, if you project it out, it could be a very big business. The part to it, just from a cursory perspective, that's challenging is that you do have to reach these populations.
Right.
How do you do that efficiently at scale?
Yeah, look, I think you make a good point. Clinical trials, and we could, I'm sure at some point we'll have a conversation about AI. But, clinical trials today are about people engaging with people. Now, that will change as we progress. But there are 2 challenges to scaling that. One is finding the right people. And, all of our people are GCP qualified, they're clinical trial experienced. And so that's a slight bottleneck as you scale. And the other thing is finding the other people, which are the patients, which I think is your question, right? How do you go find those patients? And we have 5 different ways in which we find patients. First of all, through the Lightship engagement model. And I think if you took me back to day one, I would never have thought this would be the most successful way of engaging patients, but it is. We go out, we send our teams out into communities. I'll give you an example. For an Alzheimer's study, we send our nurses and our teams out on a Sunday afternoon to Alzheimer's walks, and we talk to people and we meet them where they are. And they say, hey, I'm thinking about my mom, or I'm thinking about my father for this study, and so we engage with them. And that's been incredibly successful. Actually, reaching people where they are, that's one thing. So physical outreach, going into the communities is probably the main way. We then build, of course, a database from that. And those people say, we're open to being contacted about future trials. We have partnerships with healthcare systems, and we allow them to participate with us alongside us on studies. And we work with a lot of our sites in our site network on that. We do a bit of digital outreach. It's not the most exciting way of engaging. And then we have a structural advantage, right? So our advantage is that we're targeting patients who can't be on trials. And we're targeting the 90% of patients who don't live in the location. And so by reaching those patients, the top of our funnel is much, much bigger than a traditional model. And therefore, it works pretty well. But by far and away, the most successful and most surprising part of the growth of the business has been recruiting by actually going into communities and meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm. And, you have a deep background in the healthcare space. How did you come about choosing this specific problem area to solve?
I mean, look, my background in healthcare, I thought you were going to ask how I ended up in healthcare. That's a longer story, but
we can cover that too. Yeah.
No, your question is more interesting to answer. Look, I spent a lot of time with senior leaders in healthcare, in particular when I was at Ernst & Young. And of course, everyone's mindful of costs and how do you manage costs. And there was a constant structure of a conversation with finance teams is, hey, how can we reduce cost in commercial? How can we reduce cost in doing this? And then when the R&D leaders would come into the room, they would say, hey, if I give you $50 million more, can you get this trial back on track? Can you get it done quicker? And I thought it was a really curious anomaly, right? I know everyone knows the cost of delayed trials or the cost of failed trials and all that stuff. But to see that in it as a conversation made me think, okay, if one could solve that challenge of getting trials done faster, getting trials back on track, reaching more patients, reaching patients quicker, having less people drop out. We have 96% of our patients stay on our studies, which is an incredible completion rate. Your last patient out data comes quicker. And by doing that, you're getting the data back to the pharma companies as you're solving a real need. And that's where we started. We said that this is something that's got to be addressed. The fact that less than 10% of the population can access trials today seems crazy. We're all chasing after the same types of patients. How do we expand that? And that's the sort of the journey of how do you solve the problem for patients? And by doing that, you solve the problem for pharma and biotech companies.
Mm-hmm. And help me understand. So if the majority of populations in, given areas are in the cities, a much smaller fraction are in these like underserved areas, but you're going after those areas. Is it because like they provide another piece to the puzzle of whether or not the drug would work with these other populations? Or, is it also that just numbers game? You need more people.
Both. I mean, I think we focus on creating access for patients who wouldn't traditionally have access. So we can come back to what that subset is. But also, you just need more people on clinical trials today, right? So it is both. If you think of a city, I mean, let's take Los Angeles and then we'll take New York, right? So to give you two examples. So in Los Angeles, one of the burdens on people participating is travel time, not travel distance. Right. So, if you've got to sit in traffic for 2 hours in the middle of the day, there and back, and you're trying to earn a living, if you work in a big company and you've got a great office job or you're a CEO, you can probably do that. But if you're in the lower quartile economically, socially, economically, then you can't do that. And so you can't participate, which brings me on to the target audience of the correlation between a lower socioeconomic quartile and access to trials is shocking and frankly, a disgrace. And so that's what we're addressing. We're saying, look, these people, even if they're getting referred onto trials and they may not be because their physician is not aware of the trial, they may sign up for it, but they never complete the study because it's just too much of a burden on them. And then there is a correlation factor of lower socioeconomic and people of color in the United States. And as we know, populations of color have been massively underrepresented in clinical trials as well. And so by addressing, again, the same problem, the structural problem with, it's not about necessarily having access to it or finding out about it. It's about, can you participate over 3 years on this trial because you're having to give up days of work and not getting paid or risk getting fired. That's the problem we're solving for.
Would love to talk a little bit about your team. What's critical to ensuring that your company can scale is that you have the right senior executive team. Can you tell us a little bit more about the team makeup?
Yeah, look, I think the current team are perfect for the job today, and the previous team were perfect for the job then. And I think if we go back to advice that, you think good venture firms give you is there's a team for different seasons of the business. And as we scale right now, we just hired two incredible executives, Darcy Foreman and Michael Shipton, vastly experienced in building businesses. Darcy is Chief Operating Officer. Michael is the Chief Business Officer. And, they know how to scale businesses from where we are today to where we want to get to. They know how to do that safely. They are both passionate about patient safety, patient experience. I think as you build at the beginning, it's a very different team that you need to when you're scaling. And then, in 5 years' time, I may not be right, they may not be right because the business is in a different place. That's been a really interesting journey for me to think, constantly saying to my board, is it the right time for me to go? Because everyone's, it can be dispensed of at the right time. And I think that's a really interesting thing because, you spend your life building your career thinking, I hope I don't get fired. And now I'm saying, should you get rid of me? Should you get rid of me? And I think that's a really interesting learning from great partners as my board members.
How have you found that transition from consulting corporate to being the CEO of a startup?
Very mixed. Would I do it again? I think I probably would, but it's been really tough. If you saw a picture of me 6 years ago, I looked an awful lot younger. I even had some hair at that point. Everyone says it's harder than you could possibly imagine, and it is incredibly hard. It's also incredibly rewarding. And I think, come back to the patient piece, changing the lives of 20,000 patients makes it worthwhile. And I have learned so much. So much from great mentors. My board are incredible, having people like Michael or Darcy around me. So it's a real shift. I mean, I didn't know quite how difficult the shift was going to be until I did it. And I think if I'd known how difficult it was going to be, I might not have done it. But having done it, I wouldn't change it for the world.
Could you tell us which aspect of being the founder CEO was the most difficult?
So it's very personal. My whole career, I've been very good at fixing problems. And when you start something, there are no problems. It's a creation job, not a problem fixing job. And that's a real shift. Intellectually, it's a real shift. I don't think I've ever used my brain as much as I had in the first year. And, having a great team who are really good at creating alongside me at that point, it's a huge shift, right? When you go from a world where you go into big companies and you fix problems to there are no problems because there is nothing. Apart from the macro problem of access for patients in trials. And that's what I had to focus on. So I didn't get my head around, is this the same thing? I'm just trying to solve for a big macro problem rather than in-company problems. There are times as I've gone through the journey where we then have problems in the company. I go, this is so comfortable. Fixing these problems is easy. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, the shifting from problem solving to creation.
Okay, David, I have two final questions. One is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
Wow. I think across the work environment, I would say there are 4 or 5 people who have all had a huge influence on me. And they've all given me the same piece of advice. And it's twofold. One is try and enjoy what you're doing, even when it's not fun, because life is too short. And always have a bigger goal than yourself, right? So almost the paradoxical thing of you need to enjoy it, right? You need to come to work and think, I'm going to have a good day, even though it's going to be really tough. Mm-hmm. But the way you do that is by saying there's something bigger than me. That's why I'm doing it. And I think that's what I love about Lightship is that, our absolute passion and focus on patients and access and creating that for them.
I will tell you this before I ask my final question. I have interviewed a lot of consultants from the major firms as well. And the way we're talking right now, me asking you questions, you answering, they're a lot more substantive, the responses you're giving back to me.
Thank you.
So I think there's a difference there maybe in what you've experienced over the last few years.
It's an interesting comment. And, it's funny, I was on the phone to a friend of mine who's at a very large consulting firm just before this. I think there is a thing in consulting about being thoughtful and sharing your thoughts.
Yes.
Right. And I think in corporate, and it's interesting, having done both and then startup, in corporate, there's definitely don't really share how you feel, how you think. Mm-hmm. That's a sign of weakness. I would generally say, hey, that's an interesting question. Let's talk about that. Let's think about it. I feel like this. How do you feel? That's not a corporate answer. Corporate answer is, I know the answer. Maybe that's part of it. And it's interesting. The startup piece is, again, with the board, they've been incredible at being partners. Right? It's in a board meeting and just saying, I don't know how to do this. Can you guys help? I go back to where I started with the venture funds. I think certain funds do that really well and are supportive and want to partner with you. And I've talked to other founders who said it's a nightmare. They would never go to their board and say, I don't know what to do. So yeah, interesting.
Last question. It's typically a charity cause or other endeavor that you're passionate about, but I feel like your company is already a great cause. So it's wrapped up into that. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you like to spend your free time.
Well, I do a few things. I run. I think it's the only thing you can do when you're traveling that keeps you sane and keeps you not thinking about work. I have 4 children, so that keeps me pretty busy. And I think, outside of work, I love sport in any form. And, I love playing music. But I think there is a link to this, doing stuff for charities, in particular mental health and, mental health in young people, I think is, wonderful and valuable. So that sort of keeps me busy, but it's a pretty full-on job. I tell you that just to finish on that, I think the one bit is when you become a founder, you never ever stop work. That's the hardest thing.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. Well, David, I want to thank you again for taking the time. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome. Great to meet you. Take care.